It was June of the year 1944. The hedgerows of Normandy stood like ancient walls, tangled with centuries of bramble and root, each one taller than a man, thicker than stone. The air smelled of diesel fuel, wet earth, and something darker. Burned rubber, scorched metal, death. Beneath the turret of a battered M4 Sherman tank, Sergeant Curtis Coen knelt in the mud, his welding torch hissing blue-white sparks into the morning fog. His hands were steady, even as the ground trembled from distant artillery. His face, streaked with grease and ash, showed no fear, only focus. Just 200 yards ahead, beyond the hedgerow line, German panzer crews waited in ambush. They had learned the pattern. American tanks would nose up to a hedge, expose their soft underbelly, trying to climb over, and then, boom, one shot, one kill. It had happened 14 times in the past 3 days. 14 Sherman tanks turned into steel coffins, 14 crews burned alive or torn apart by shrapnel before they even saw the enemy. Cullen had no authorization for what he was doing. He had no engineering approval, no officer's permission, no supply requisition. The modifications he was welding onto the front of his Sherman, steel teeth salvaged from German beach obstacles, were strictly against regulations. His commanding officer had told him flat out, "We don't modify Army equipment in the field. We use what we're given." But Coen had watched his friends die. He had pulled charred bodies from turrets. He had seen the pattern, and he understood the math. If something didn't change, every Sherman in Normandy was a ticking clock. So he made a decision. Without a single signature, without clearance from Washington or battalion headquarters, Curtis Coen picked up a torch, cut steel from Hitler's Atlantic Wall, and changed the course of the war. 5 days earlier, inside a rain-soaked command tent near Sainte-Mère-Église, Curtis Coen sat on a wooden crate as his battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Fraser, addressed the assembled tank crews of the 2nd Armored Division. "No field modifications," Fraser said, his voice clipped and firm. "I don't care how creative you think you are. I don't care what your buddy in the motor pool says he can weld. Army equipment is designed by engineers, tested by experts, and approved by command. You do not alter it. Period." The room was silent, except for the patter of rain on canvas. Men shifted uncomfortably. Some nodded, others stared at the ground. Fraser continued. "Every pound you add to the front of a Sherman changes its balance, its speed, its clearance. You think you're helping, but you could be making it worse. You could flip the tank. You could crack the transmission. You could get your entire crew killed because you thought you knew better than General Motors." He paused, then added, "If I catch anyone welding unauthorized modifications, it's an Article 15. Understood?" The men mumbled agreement. Coen said nothing, but his jaw tightened. Outside, the battle for Normandy was entering its most brutal phase. On June 6th, Allied forces had stormed 5 beaches and punched a hole in Hitler's fortress Europe. But now, 2 weeks later, progress had stalled. The hedgerows, ancient earthen walls covered in thick vegetation, turned every field into a killing box. German defenders dug in behind them. Invisible, patient, deadly. American tank doctrine had been designed for open terrain, sweep across France, race toward Germany, overwhelm the enemy with speed and numbers. But the hedgerows changed everything. Tanks couldn't see over them. Infantry couldn't advance without armor support. And every time a Sherman tried to push through or climb over a hedge, it exposed its thin belly armor. And the Germans were waiting. Panzer crews, especially those in Tiger and Panther tanks, had learned to position themselves at the far end of fields, hidden in tree lines or barn ruins, angled to hit American tanks the moment they crested a hedgerow. The 88 mm rounds from a Tiger could punch through a Sherman's underside like a hot knife through butter. The result was instant and catastrophic. Ammunition cooked off, fuel ignited, men screamed. And so the rule was clear. Do not modify your tank. Do not improvise. Do not deviate from approved equipment and tactics. For Curtis Coen, that meant sitting in his Sherman, waiting for engineers to clear paths with explosives, paths that took hours to make and always seemed to lead straight into German crosshairs. It meant watching other crews go first, watching them die, and then following the same route, hoping the odds would somehow be different. But Coen wasn't a gambler. He was a welder, and he had started to see a solution that no manual, no officer, and no engineer had considered. The problem wasn't the tank. It wasn't the crew. It was the hedge. And if you couldn't go over it, you had to go through it. He just needed steel, a torch, and the willingness to disobey a direct order. Curtis Gerald Coen was not born a soldier. He grew up in the coal towns of eastern Pennsylvania, where the skyline was dominated by smokestacks and slag heaps, and every man over the age of 14 either worked in the mines or the railroads. His father, Gerald, was a welder for the Reading Railroad, repairing freight cars and steam locomotives in a cavernous repair yard that smelled like hot metal and coal dust. His mother, Margaret, worked nights as a seamstress, stitching uniforms for the Pennsylvania National Guard. Curtis grew up with a welding torch in one hand and a wrench in the other. By the time he was 12, he could patch a cracked boiler plate. By 15, he was helping his father reinforce railcar chassis during the Depression, when every repair had to last twice as long because there was no money for replacements. Even as a boy, he saw the world through structural logic. When other kids played baseball, Curtis was sketching bridge designs in the dirt with a stick, figuring out how to distribute weight across beams. When a neighbor's porch collapsed, Curtis told him exactly where the support had failed and how to fix it so it wouldn't happen again. He didn't join the army because he wanted to fight. He enlisted in 1942 because the draft was coming anyway, and he figured if he was going to war, he'd rather go as a tanker than an infantryman. At least tanks had armor. At least you had a machine between you and the bullets. By the time Curtis arrived in Normandy on June 10th, 4 days after D-Day, he was 26 years old, lean and sinewy, with forearms marked by burn scars from a decade of welding work. His first day in France, he helped pull a dead driver out of a Sherman that had taken a direct hit from a Panzerfaust. The body came out in pieces. Curtis didn't vomit. He didn't cry. He just stared at the hole in the tank's side armor and thought, that's a weld point. If we'd reinforced that seam, maybe he'd still be alive. His first real combat experience came 2 days later in the village of Carentan. His Sherman, part of a 5-tank column, was advancing down a narrow farm road when the lead tank hit a mine. The second tank tried to reverse and got stuck in a ditch. The third took an 88 mm round through the turret. Curtis's tank, fourth in line, was suddenly the front. German infantry swarmed from the hedges, Panzerfaust teams, machine gunners, riflemen. Curtis's crew fired everything they had, the 75 mm main gun, the 50 cal on the turret, the coaxial machine gun. They held the road for 20 minutes until reinforcements arrived. When it was over, Curtis climbed out of the tank and found 17 bullet impacts on the hull, 3 on the turret, and a Panzerfaust round that had struck the front glacis plate, but failed to penetrate. He ran his hand over the dent. The armor had held, barely. If that rocket had hit 6 inches lower, or if the angle had been slightly different, he and his crew would be dead. That night, sitting in a bombed-out farmhouse with his crew, Curtis started sketching. He drew the Sherman from the side, then from the front. He marked weak points: the belly, the lower glacis, the turret ring. Then he started drawing solutions, reinforcement plates, deflection angles, structural braces. On the morning of June 20th, 1944, the fog hung low and thick across the fields of Normandy. It clung to the earth like a burial shroud. Sound was muffled. Vision was limited to 30 yards, maybe 40. But through the mist, Curtis Coen could see the problem clearly. The hedgerow ahead of him, called a bocage by the locals, stood 12 feet high, a solid wall of earth and roots built up over 1,000 years of farming. Trees sprouted from the top. Brambles thick as a man's wrist tangled through the sides, and at the base, the roots went down 8, 10, sometimes 12 feet into the Norman clay. It wasn't just an obstacle. It was a fortress. Behind that hedgerow, somewhere in the next field, German forces waited. They always did. Intelligence reports said it was elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Division. Veteran troops, well-equipped, disciplined. They had Panther tanks, 88mm anti-tank guns, Panzerfaust teams, and something the Americans had learned to fear more than anything: patience. The German tactic was simple and devastatingly effective. Let the Americans approach. Let them try to cross the hedge. The moment a Sherman nosed up and started to climb, its underside would be exposed. Thin armor, just 25mm thick, angled upward like a target. One shot from a Panther's 75 calibre gun or a Tiger's 88mm, and the Sherman was finished. The round would punch through the belly, detonate inside of the crew compartment, ignite the ammunition, and turn the tank into a crematorium in under 3 seconds. Curtis had seen it happen 14 times in 5 days. The first time, it was a tank from B Company. The Sherman had nudged up to a hedgerow, engine roaring, treads churning mud. It climbed halfway up, tilted backward, and then the flash came. A single orange streak from across the field. The explosion was so violent it blew the turret 20 feet into the air. It landed upside down in a ditch. No one got out. The second time it was Curtis's friend, Staff Sergeant Mike Kowalski, a welder from Pittsburgh, who'd taught Curtis a trick for patching cracked engine mounts. Mike's tank made it over the hedge, dropped into the next field, and immediately took a round through the floor. The tank rolled forward another 10 yards, trailing smoke, then stopped. Curtis ran to it. The hull was still glowing red-hot. He couldn't get close. By the 5th day, the entire battalion knew the pattern. Approaching a hedgerow was a death sentence. But orders were orders. The division needed to push south, break out of the Normandy pocket, link up with Patton's Third Army. So tanks kept moving forward, kept climbing hedges, kept dying. The engineers tried everything. They brought in bulldozers to push through hedgerows, slow, loud, and the dozers got targeted first. They tried explosives, effective, but it took an hour to rig charges, and by then the Germans had repositioned. They even tried sending infantry first to scout. But without tank support, the infantry got pinned down by machine gun fire. The problem was geometric and brutal. A Sherman tank, sitting level, had decent frontal armor, 76mm on the glacis plate, sloped at 56 degrees, hard to penetrate from the front. But the moment it tilted upward to climb a hedge, that angle changed. The belly armor, flat and thin, became perpendicular to enemy fire, a perfect 90-degree target, and the Germans knew it. They positioned their anti-tank guns at the far ends of fields, 300 to 500 yards away, close enough to guarantee a hit, far enough to be hidden in tree lines or farm buildings. They waited until American tanks were committed, halfway up the hedge, unable to reverse quickly. Then they fired. To Curtis Coen, sitting in his Sherman on the morning of June 20th, staring at yet another hedgerow, the situation was simple. The tank couldn't go over the hedge without dying. Engineers couldn't clear the hedge fast enough. Infantry couldn't advance without tanks. But what if the tank didn't have to go over the hedge? What if it could go through it? He thought back to D-Day, to the beach obstacles he'd seen at Omaha, steel rails and I-beams the Germans had planted in the sand to rip the bottoms out of landing craft. Tons of them, thick, heavy, sharp. And now, 2 weeks later, most of them were still there, half buried in the tide line, rusting. Curtis looked at his Sherman. Then he looked at the hedgerow. Then he looked at his welding torch, sitting in the back of the tank. And he made a decision. That night, under cover of darkness, Curtis and 2 men from his crew, Tommy Marsh and a driver named Eddie Pyle, drove back toward the beach. They brought a cutting torch, a truck, and a hammer. By dawn, they had 4 sections of German steel, each about 5 feet long, jagged and heavy. They loaded them into the truck, covered them with a tarp, and drove back to the tank park. Curtis didn't ask permission. He didn't file a requisition. He just started cutting, measuring, and welding. By noon, his Sherman had steel teeth. His loader, a kid from Ohio named Tommy Marsh, looked over his shoulder and said, "You thinking about armor?" Curtis nodded. "I'm thinking about how to not die." Other tankers started calling him the Tinker, because he was always fiddling with something, adjusting the suspension, rigging extra ammo racks, welding handles onto the turret so infantry could hitch rides. But it wasn't tinkering, it was survival engineering. What the Army didn't realize, what even his own crew didn't fully understand, was that Curtis Coen wasn't just a good welder. He was a problem solver, a man who saw failure not as fate, but as a design flaw. And in 3 days' time, that Coal Town welder with the burn-scarred hands would take a pile of scrap steel and rewrite American tank doctrine, one unauthorized weld at a time. Because sometimes survival doesn't come from following the manual. It comes from knowing when to throw it away. Curtis Coen had never disobeyed a direct order. Not in training, not at Fort Knox, not even when a sergeant told him to dig a latrine in freezing rain. He believed in structure, in discipline, in the chain of command. But he also believed in one thing more, bringing his crew home alive. And so, on the morning of June 21st, 1944, Curtis Coen became a criminal. He started with measurements. The front of a Sherman tank, from track to track, was roughly 8 feet wide. The glacis plate, the sloped frontal armor, angled down to a lower hull that sat about 2 feet off the ground. Curtis needed something that would extend forward, low enough to bite into the base of a hedgerow, strong enough to push through roots and packed earth, and angled to prevent the tank from riding up. He sketched it out on a piece of cardboard. 4 steel prongs, each 5 feet long, welded horizontally across the lower glacis at a 30-degree downward angle. Like tusks, like a boar. The steel he'd taken from the beach, German-Belgian gate obstacles, was perfect. Each piece was forged I-beam construction, 2 inches thick, designed to withstand the impact of landing craft. Curtis cut them into sections using a portable oxyacetylene torch, the kind railroad welders used for field repairs. The cutting took 2 hours. His hands ached. The torch hissed and spat. Sparks showered into the mud. Tommy Marsh and Eddie Pyle stood watch, nervous, glancing over their shoulders every few minutes. "Sarge," Tommy said quietly, "if Fraser catches us—" "He won't," Curtis said, not looking up. "But if he does, then I take the fall." "You two were just following orders." Eddie snorted. "That's not how the army works." Curtis shut off the torch and looked at them. "You want to keep climbing hedges the way we've been doing? You want to flip belly up for the next Panther crew?" Neither man answered. Curtis nodded. "Then help me lift this." They positioned the first prong across the lower hull, flat against the armor, extending forward like a lance. Curtis marked the contact points with chalk, then fired up the Welder, a small portable unit he'd borrowed from the motor pool. The arc crackled to life, white-hot and blinding. Welding in the field was tricky. The metal had to be clean, dry, and properly grounded. The joints had to be solid. If they failed under stress, the prong could twist, jam the tracks, or worse, break off and flip backward into the crew compartment. Curtis worked slowly, methodically. He ran 3-inch beads along each contact point, then reinforced them with cross braces. He checked the angles with a level. He tapped each weld with a hammer, listening for weak spots. By mid-afternoon, he had 2 prongs mounted. By evening, all 4 were in place. The final product looked brutal and improvised, which it was. 4 jagged steel tusks jutting forward from the front of the Sherman, angled down like the horns of a charging bull. The welds were thick and ugly, but solid. Curtis ran his hand along them. No flecks, no gaps. Tommy stared at the tank. "It looks like a monster." Curtis wiped the sweat from his face. "Good. Maybe the Germans will think twice." But the real test wasn't scaring the enemy. It was whether the modification would work, whether it would cut through a hedgerow without flipping the tank, without breaking the welds, without getting them all killed. And there was no way to know until they tried. The next morning, Curtis drove his Sherman to an empty field on the edge of the American line. No officers around, no observers, just him, his crew, and a hedgerow. He lined up the tank perpendicular to the hedge, about 20 yards back. He revved the engine. The Sherman rumbled, diesel smoke pouring from the exhausts. Tommy, standing in the turret hatch, said, "You sure about this, Sarge?" Curtis put the tank in gear. "Nope." He pushed the throttle forward. The Sherman lurched ahead, tracks biting into the mud. The engine roared, 20 yards, 15, 10. The steel prongs hit the base of the hedgerow with a grinding crunch. For a split second, the tank shuddered, and Curtis thought, "It's going to flip. I just killed us." But then the prongs bit deep. The roots snapped, the earth split, and the Sherman punched through the hedgerow like a fist through paper. They exploded into the next field in a shower of dirt, branches, and torn roots. The tank rocked, steadied, and rolled forward. Curtis stopped, shut off the engine. The silence was deafening. Tommy climbed down from the turret, staring back at the hole they'd just made. A clean gap, wide enough for 2 tanks, side by side. "Holy hell," Tommy whispered. Eddie grinned. "Do that again." Curtis didn't smile. He just looked at the welds, still solid. No cracks, no breaks. It worked. But now came the hard part, convincing the army to let him do it to every Sherman in Normandy. And that meant breaking the rules one more time. Curtis Cullen didn't tell his commanding officer what he'd done. Not yet. He knew how it would go. Fraser would order him to remove the modification, threaten him with an Article 15, maybe even pull him from combat duty. And Curtis couldn't risk that. Not when he'd just solved the problem that was killing American tankers every single day. So instead, he did something smarter. He went back to the field and kept testing. Over the next 2 days, Curtis drove his modified Sherman through 6 different hedgerows. Each one was thicker than the last. Each time, the steel prongs bit into the earth, the roots snapped, and the tank punched through. No flipping, no getting stuck, no exposing the belly. Word spread fast. Tank crews started showing up to watch. By the 3rd test, there were 20 men standing at the edge of the field, some from Curtis's battalion, others from neighboring units. They watched in silence as the Sherman charged a hedgerow, hit it at full speed, and exploded through to the other side in a spray of dirt and vegetation. One sergeant, a Texan named Bill Hargrove, walked up to Curtis afterward and said, "Where'd you get those teeth?" "Off the beach," Curtis said. "German obstacles." Hargrove nodded slowly. "You got authorization for this?" Curtis met his eyes. "No," Hargrove grinned. "Good. Can you do it to mine?" By June 23rd, Curtis had modified 4 more Shermans, all from different companies, all unofficially. He worked at night, using salvaged steel and borrowed welding equipment. The crews helped him cut, lift, and position the prongs. No one filed paperwork. No one asked permission. And then, on June 24th, the real test came. Curtis's platoon was assigned to push south toward the town of Saint-Lô, a critical crossroads that the Germans were defending with everything they had. The route ran through 3 miles of dense hedgerow country, some of the worst terrain in Normandy. Curtis's Sherman, now nicknamed the Rhino by his crew, was 3rd in the column. The lead tank was a standard M4 with no modifications. The second tank was another Rhino, modified by Curtis 2 nights earlier. They rolled out at dawn. The fog was heavy. The air smelled like wet grass and diesel. Radio chatter was minimal. Everyone knew what was coming. The first hedgerow appeared a mile into the advance. The lead tank, following doctrine, stopped and waited for engineers to clear a path with explosives. But before the engineers could move up, German mortar fire started dropping. Rounds hit the road, the ditches, the trees. Shrapnel pinged off tank hulls. Infantry scattered. Curtis keyed his radio. "Lead tank, this is Rhino 3. Request permission to take point." There was a pause. Then the platoon leader, Lieutenant Davis, came on. "Rhino 3, you're not authorized for—" "Sir, I can get through the hedge. Right now. No explosives needed." Another pause. Curtis could hear the mortars falling closer. Finally, Davis said, "Do it. But if you get stuck, we're leaving you." Curtis didn't respond. He just shifted into gear, pulled around the lead tank, and drove straight at the hedgerow. 30 yards, 20, 10. The steel prongs hit the base of the hedge with a bone-rattling crunch. The entire tank shook, roots tore, earth sprayed. And then they were through, clean, fast, into the next field. Behind him, the second Rhino followed, then the third, then the fourth. In less than 2 minutes, the entire platoon had punched through a hedgerow that would have taken engineers an hour to clear. They hit another hedge 500 yards later. Curtis went through first, again, then another, then another. By noon, they had advanced farther in 4 hours than the battalion had moved in the previous 2 days. And then they hit contact. The field ahead was wide and open, bordered by a thick tree line on the far side. Curtis's instincts screamed ambush, but there was no other route. They had to cross. He was halfway across when the first shot came, a streak of orange from the tree line. The round missed, impacting 20 yards to the left in a fountain of dirt. "Panther!" Tommy yelled from the turret. 11 o'clock! Tree line! Curtis yanked the controls, angling the Sherman to present the frontal armor. The 75mm gun swung toward the target. Eddie, the gunner, called out, "On target! Fire!" The Sherman bucked as the main gun roared. The round streaked across the field and slammed into the base of a tree. Smoke erupted, but no secondary explosion. The Panther fired again. This time the round hit, a glancing blow off the front glacis that sent a shockwave through the entire tank. Curtis felt his teeth rattle, but the armor held. "He's moving!" Tommy shouted. "He's repositioning!" Curtis didn't hesitate. He floored the throttle and drove straight at the tree line, not away from the Panther, but toward it. "Sarge, what are you doing?" Eddie yelled. Curtis didn't answer. He aimed for a gap in the trees, a thin hedgerow that separated the field from the forest. The steel prongs hit it at 20 miles per hour. The hedge exploded. The Sherman crashed through into the forest, branches scraping the turret, roots snapping under the tracks. And suddenly, they were 30 yards from the Panther, too close for the German crew to depress their gun. Eddie didn't wait for orders. He fired. The 75mm round hit the Panther's side armor at point-blank range. The explosion ripped the turret off its ring. Flames poured from the hull. Curtis reversed, backing out of the tree line. His heart hammered. His hands shook. But the tank was intact. The prongs were intact, and they were alive. Lieutenant Davis came over the radio, his voice tight. "Rhino 3, what the hell was that?" Curtis keyed the mic. "Sir, that was a field modification." There was a long silence. Then Davis said, "When we get back, you're going to show me how you did that." Curtis smiled for the first time in days. "Yes, sir." For 72 hours, Curtis Cullen expected to be arrested. After the engagement near St. Lo, after the Panther kill, after his entire platoon made it back without a single loss, he sat on the back of his Sherman and waited for the hammer to fall. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Fraser, read the after-action report without saying a word. He flipped through the pages. Curtis's diagram of the modification, the engagement timeline, the photographs another tanker had taken of the Rhino punching through hedgerows. Fraser finally looked up. His expression was unreadable. "Sergeant Cullen, you modified your tank without authorization." "Yes, sir." "You used salvaged enemy equipment." "Yes, sir." "You welded structural changes to a combat vehicle in a forward area without engineering review, without testing protocols, without approval from division or corps." Curtis nodded. "Yes, sir." Fraser stared at him. Then he said, "And you killed a Panther at 30 yards because you drove through a hedgerow no one thought you could get through." "Yes, sir." Fraser closed the report. He stood up, walked to the tent flap, and looked out at the tank park, where 3 more Shermans were being fitted with steel prongs by crews who had heard what Curtis had done. "You know," Fraser said quietly, "if even one of those welds had failed, if your tank had flipped, if you'd gotten your crew killed, I would have court-martialed you myself." Curtis didn't respond. Fraser turned around. "But you didn't. And because of what you did, I just got orders to modify every Sherman in this division. Engineers are already cutting steel. The Corps wants a demonstration for Bradley himself." Curtis blinked. "Sir?" Fraser walked back to his desk and picked up a piece of paper. "This came from 1st Army HQ this morning. They're calling it the Coen device. They want production models built by next week. They're sending you to brief tank commanders from 3 other divisions." Curtis felt the ground shift under him. "Sir, I'm just a welder." Fraser smiled, the first time Curtis had ever seen it. "You're a welder who just saved this division from getting stuck in Normandy for another month. Maybe longer." He handed Curtis the paper. It was a commendation citation, signed by General Omar Bradley. "For initiative, ingenuity, and courage under fire," Fraser read aloud. "Sergeant Curtis G. Coen is hereby recognized for developing a field modification that has significantly enhanced the combat effectiveness of American armor in the European theater." Curtis stared at the paper. His hands were shaking. Fraser sat back down. "Now get out of here. You've got 20 tanks to modify before the St. Lo offensive kicks off." Curtis saluted, turned to leave. "Coen," Fraser called after him. Curtis stopped. "Next time you decide to break the rules," Fraser said, "give me a little warning first." Curtis almost smiled. "Yes, sir." Within 2 weeks, the Cullen device, officially designated the Hedgerow Cutter M1, was being welded onto Sherman tanks across Normandy. Ordnance depots shipped pre-cut steel prongs. Welding crews worked around the clock. By July 10th, more than 500 Shermans had been modified, and the results were immediate. Tank units that had been stalled for days suddenly broke through German lines. Hedgerows that had been death traps became minor obstacles. The Germans, who had relied on the bocage to slow the American advance, found their defensive strategy collapsing. One German officer, captured near Coutances, was asked during interrogation why his unit had retreated so quickly. He said, "The American tanks started coming through the hedges, not over them, through them. We couldn't stop them." It was like they had become unstoppable. But not everyone was celebrating. Back in Washington, Army ordnance officials were furious. An unauthorized field modification had been adopted across an entire theater without going through proper testing, approval, or procurement channels. Some engineers argued that the added weight could damage transmissions. Others worried about the welds failing under stress. A formal review was convened. Curtis was called to testify, not in France, but via written report. He explained his design, his reasoning, his testing process. He included photographs, diagrams, and testimonials from tank crews. The review board's conclusion, issued in August 1944, was blunt. The Coen device, while developed outside standard procedures, has proven effective in combat and is hereby approved for continued use. But buried in the report was a line that Curtis would never see. Future field modifications of this nature should be submitted through proper channels before implementation. In other words, it worked, but don't do it again. Curtis didn't care. By that point, he was back in France, welding prongs onto Shermans and training crews on how to use them. He didn't talk about medals or recognition. He talked about angles, root depth, weld integrity. One afternoon, a reporter from Stars and Stripes tracked him down and asked for an interview. Curtis refused. The reporter pushed, "Sergeant, you're a hero. The whole army's talking about you." Curtis looked at him. "I'm not a hero, I'm a welder. Heroes are the guys who didn't make it home." The reporter tried again. "But you saved lives. You changed the war." Curtis picked up his torch. "I fixed a problem, that's all." And he walked away. Curtis Cullen never asked to be remembered. He didn't keep a journal, he didn't pose for photographs. After the war, he went home to Pennsylvania, married a schoolteacher named Dorothy from his hometown, and opened a small welding and fabrication shop in Scranton. He built staircases, repaired factory equipment, taught his son how to run a bead without leaving gaps. He never once called himself an innovator, but others did. Because years after the Battle of Normandy, the U.S. Army quietly began teaching something they called field expedient modifications under combat conditions. A fancy term for a deceptively simple idea. Soldiers on the ground often see solutions that engineers thousands of miles away cannot. The case study they used, a single modification outside Sainte-Mère-Église, France. They showed photographs of the Coen device, diagrams of the weld points, before and after photos of hedgerows. No names were given in the early versions. The file was unclassified, but buried in armor doctrine manuals that most officers never read. Still, the students at Fort Knox, and later at Fort Benning, studied it. Because it worked. Because it saved lives. Because it proved that innovation doesn't always come from laboratories. Sometimes it comes from desperation, a welding torch, and a willingness to disobey a bad rule. When the Army developed the M60 tank in the 1960s, engineers included provisions for field modifications. When the M1 Abrams was designed in the 1980s, doctrine explicitly allowed crews to adapt their vehicles based on combat experience. The lineage went back to Curtis Coen, though his name had been lost in the bureaucratic shuffle. Years later, a military historian named Dr. Paul Hendricks stumbled across the original after-action reports filed by Lieutenant Colonel Fraser. Buried in a cardboard box in the National Archives, stamped with a faded blue ink, 2nd Armored Division, June 1944. Hendricks tracked down Curtis, now in his 80s, slightly deaf, living in a modest house with his wife and a dog named Sergeant. He asked Curtis about that day in Normandy, the day he first welded steel to a Sherman. Curtis took a long time to answer. Then he said, "I remember the fog. I remember how quiet it was before we hit the hedge, like the world was holding its breath." He didn't speak of glory or validation, just the weight of the torch, the smell of hot metal, the hope that it would work. When asked why he didn't wait for permission, Curtis replied, "Because by the time permission came through, my friends would have been dead." He paused, then added, "I didn't break the rules to be a hero. I broke them because the rules were going to get us all killed." That answer never made it into the official history books, but it stuck with Hendricks, and now, maybe, with you. Curtis Coen didn't win the war, but he saved a division. He saved hundreds of tank crews. He saved a summer offensive that might have stalled for months. And in war, sometimes that's everything. He reminded the Army that courage isn't always loud, that innovation doesn't always come from the top, and that sometimes the best way to follow orders is to know when to disobey them. Not out of arrogance, but out of a deeper duty to the men beside you. One welder, one torch, one decision, and 400 Sherman crews who made it home because Curtis Coen decided that survival mattered more than regulations.